It was nearly midnight when Keanu stepped outside the soundstage for some air. The city was quiet, in that particular way New York could be, loud somewhere, but never where you stood. Wind swept through the alley beside the studio, carrying the faint scent of paint, thinner and something older. Almost nostalgic. He paused. That smell. It wasn't new paint. It was oil-based, the kind you used when colors mattered more than deadlines. He followed the scent past the dumpsters, past rows of coiled cables and shipping crates. There, tucked between a stack of plywood sheets and a portable toilet, sat a small folding stool, and on it, a man in a Navy security uniform, brush in hand, painting quietly under a bare bulb. The man didn't look up. He just kept working. Broad, practiced strokes across a weathered canvas propped on his lap. The image was still forming. A street lamp, a mailbox, the curve of a fire escape, all washed in sepia and early blue. Keanu said nothing at first, just watched. The man noticed him eventually and smiled, soft and a little sheepish. Didn't mean to break the fourth wall, he said, voice rough with age but calm. Keanu smiled, not breaking anything, just wasn't expecting art next to the porta-potty. The man chuckled, setting the brush gently down. Name's Arthur. I do the night rounds here. Most folks don't notice much once it gets past 10 p.m. Keanu stepped closer, careful not to cast shadow over the painting. You always paint out here, only when I know no one's looking. Makes the world quieter somehow. Keanu glanced at the half-finished piece again. It wasn't flashy, but there was emotion in the angles. Loneliness, maybe. Or longing. You ever show your work? Arthur shook his head. Not since the 80s. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Arthur went on, almost casually. Used to have a small studio in Brooklyn. Ran it with a couple friends. Then life did what it does. Bills stacked up. My wife got sick. Art didn't pay the rent, but security did. He gestured at the bar on his chest. Been doing this ever since. There was no bitterness in his tone. Just fact. Keanu respected that. Mind if I watch? Arthur blinked. You mean now? Yeah, just watch. Arthur hesitated, only a second before lifting the brush again. Keanu leaned against a nearby crate and settled in, silent. It was 20 minutes before either of them spoke again. When Arthur finally capped his paint and wiped his hands with an old rag, he looked over with a kind of curiosity he hadn't worn in years. You're you, right? Keanu smiled faintly. Yeah, but tonight, I'm just a guy watching another guy paint something honest. Arthur chuckled. Haven't had an audience in decades. You deserve one. Arthur looked away, like the compliment had landed too directly. They talked a bit more after that. About old brushes. About paint that doesn't dry right in winter. About the time Arthur sold a piece to a woman who cried when she saw it, but never explained why. Keanu didn't interrupt much, just listened. When his assistant came calling on the radio about an early call time, Keanu thanked Arthur for the conversation, then paused before heading back. Hey, he said, you ever think about painting something bigger again? Showing it? Arthur shrugged, brushing paint flecks from his slacks. That part of my life's in the past. Keanu nodded slowly. Maybe. But some colors don't fade. They just wait. Then he left, quietly, like he arrived. Arthur sat alone for a while longer, staring at the canvas. He hadn't told the full truth. He didn't just miss painting. He missed being seen. The next night, Keanu came back, not because he had to, not because he owed anything, but because something about Arthur, the way he painted in silence, the way he spoke without asking for anything, had settled in his mind, like a song you don't realize you've been humming all day. The alley behind the soundstage was quieter than usual. The hum of generators had dimmed, and even the sky felt softer. Clouds drifting above the city like forgotten thoughts. Keanu rounded the corner, expecting to see Arthur painting again. But Arthur wasn't holding a brush. He was sitting there, same folding stool, same spot, just staring off into the dark, with a thermos in his hand and nothing in front of him but a cracked pavement and a rusted utility box. Keanu approached casually. "Cold night," he said, voice low and calm. Arthur nodded without looking. "Coffee helps." Keanu leaned against a crate a few feet away, careful not to intrude on whatever quiet the old man was wrapped in. They sat in silence for a while. Keanu didn't mind. Arthur seemed like the kind of man who only spoke when words meant something. Eventually, Arthur exhaled. "You ever feel like the world moved on without you?" he asked. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, as if the clouds might hold some kind of answer. "Sometimes," he said. "Usually when I stop long enough to notice." Arthur smiled at that. "Just a little." "That's the trick, isn't it? Keep moving. Don't think too much. Just work, eat, sleep, repeat." Keanu studied him for a moment. "Is that what you've been doing?" Arthur shrugged. "It's what most of us do, especially when the dreams stop paying the bills." He took a long sip of coffee, then added, "It's funny though. No one's asked me about my paintings in years. Not even my kids, not my co-workers. Just you." Keanu didn't respond. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he knew that wasn't what Arthur needed right now. Arthur continued, "I used to paint every day. Colors meant something back then. I had this one piece. Called it December Inside. It was just a kitchen table with morning light coming through a broken blind. But it said everything I couldn't." He paused. "It sold. A woman in Queens. She cried when she saw it. Told me it looked like her childhood." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's art." Arthur chuckled. "That was 38 years ago." They both looked off into the dark for a bit. The city hummed around them, indifferent. "Why'd you stop?" Keanu asked softly. Arthur looked down at his hands. "My wife got sick. I had 2 kids in school. The gallery gigs dried up, and I couldn't justify spending money on paint when the roof was leaking." He sipped again. "Then she passed. And by then, the brushes felt heavier than they used to." Keanu looked at him carefully. "But you still paint." "Only when no one's watching." Keanu folded his arms. "You ever want to show your work again?" Arthur let out a low laugh, more breath than sound. "At my age?" "Yeah," Keanu said. "At your age." Arthur eyed him, unsure if it was a joke. "It wasn't. You think anyone would care?" he asked. Keanu answered without hesitation. "I think people care more than you think. but they can't care about what they don't see. Arthur didn't say anything, but Keanu saw it in his face. The flicker of something, not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of it. Later that night, as Keanu returned to his trailer, he made a quiet decision. No press, no big announcement, no showy gestures, just something real, something quiet, like Arthur. 3 days later, Arthur arrived at work to find a plain cardboard box sitting beside his stool. Inside was a new set of oil paints, a fresh stack of canvases, a bundle of high-quality brushes, and a small note tucked into the bottom. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, almost meditative. Some colors don't fade. They just wait to be used again. K. Arthur stared at the note for a long time, longer than he meant to. Then, with hands that trembled slightly from age, but not from doubt, he picked up the first brush in years that hadn't come from a thrift store, and he began to paint not just a building or a fire escape, but light and memory, and maybe, just maybe, the start of something that had been waiting far too long. Keanu didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not his agent, not his publicist, not even the production manager, who had to shuffle a scene because he left set 15 minutes early that Thursday afternoon. He just walked out the studio gates, got into a nondescript black car, and drove to a part of Brooklyn he hadn't been to in years. Not since before The Matrix. Not since before his name meant something in the rooms where decisions were made. But this wasn't about names. This was about Arthur and the world that had slowly forgotten him. The first stop was a frame shop. Keanu spent almost an hour there, quietly choosing the kind of warm walnut finish that didn't draw too much attention, but still said, someone cared enough to preserve this. The second stop was a tiny gallery tucked between a bakery and a laundromat, the Wren Collective, run by a woman named Grace, who had gray streaks in her curls and a habit of using words like aching and honest to describe paintings. Keanu showed her a photo he'd discreetly taken of Arthur's canvas a few nights ago. Just a small corner of a city under evening light. Grace stared at it for a long time. Then she asked, "Who is he?" Keanu said, "Someone you've never heard of." She nodded. "That's the best kind." He explained what he wanted to do. Grace listened without blinking. No selfies, no social media posts, no sponsored by. Just a quiet night. One wall, 3 hours. People who care. People who see. She said yes. She said, "He paints like someone who misses things he can't name." Keanu smiled. He does. Back on set that night, Arthur was in his usual spot, brush in hand, hunched slightly over a new canvas. The alley was silent, except for the soft strokes of bristles against cloth. Keanu didn't say anything, just sat nearby with a paper cup of black coffee and watched. Arthur spoke first this time. "The paints you left, they're too good. I don't know what to do with too good anymore." Keanu smiled into his cup. "You could try using them." Arthur smirked. "I am. But they're making me feel things I thought I buried." "That's usually how you know you're doing it right," Keanu said. Arthur paused. He didn't ask who left the box. He didn't thank him. That wasn't how men like Arthur worked. They weren't built for receiving, they were built for enduring. But that night, as Keanu watched him work under the alley light, he noticed something new in the way Arthur painted. Less hiding, more remembering. The next few days moved quickly. Keanu returned each evening. Sometimes he and Arthur talked about art. Sometimes they sat in silence. Once, they talked about color theory for half an hour, debating whether cerulean blue had too much ego. Arthur seemed lighter now, not younger, but less heavy. And then one night, Keanu didn't show. Arthur noticed. He wouldn't have said it, but he did. He checked his watch more than usual, glanced at the alley mouth when he heard footsteps. When the clock struck midnight, he sighed and packed his paints. Movie stars got better places to be, he muttered, but not bitterly. Just like someone who didn't expect people to stay. What Arthur didn't know was that just 2 miles away, Keanu was standing in the middle of the Wren Collective, hanging 6 of Arthur's paintings with his own 2 hands. No assistants, no crew, just him, Grace, and the faint smell of spackle and old coffee. Each piece had been framed with care, each one titled by Arthur's own handwriting, copied from the backs of the original canvases. Window 4:17 p.m. Brooklyn, first rain, laundry and sky. Her coffee still warm. Inside December, and one without a title. Just a date. March 3rd, 1985. Keanu stood back and looked at the wall, then whispered, almost to himself, "Some stories deserve to be seen." The gallery was ready. The invites had been quietly sent to a small list. Local artists, friends of Grace, a few curators who still believed in finding beauty off the beaten path. No red carpet, no press. Only one name printed on the modest card. An evening with Arthur Lewis. Arthur had no idea, but soon he would. It was Thursday night when Keanu asked Arthur to take a walk. Nothing dramatic, no big gestures, just a quiet suggestion while the paint on Arthur's latest canvas was still drying. "You ever get out of here before your shift ends?" Keanu asked, sipping coffee from a cup that had long gone cold. Arthur blinked. "Not often." "Why?" "Just thought maybe we'd take a ride. There's something I want to show you." Arthur squinted. "What, like a movie set?" Keanu shrugged. "Sort of. But it's already finished. Come on." Arthur hesitated. He looked at the canvas in his lap, still damp at the corners. Then at the wall clock above the service door. 11:42 p.m. The world could wait. They rode in silence most of the way. Keanu drove, eyes forward, hands calm on the wheel, like he was carrying something fragile. Arthur didn't ask where they were going. That was his nature. He wasn't someone who pried. He'd spent a lifetime not being asked questions. He'd learned not to expect answers either. But he watched the neighborhoods roll by, and as they crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, something in his chest stirred. He hadn't been back in years, not since the gallery closed. Not since the landlord raised the rent and the roof caved in. Literally and metaphorically, the car pulled up outside a small building with a soft light pouring from its windows. Nothing flashy, just a clean storefront wedged between a bakery and a place that sold second-hand records. Above the door, a small wooden sign read, "The Wren Collective." Keanu got out first. Arthur followed slowly, unsure why they were here. "You hungry?" he asked. Keanu smiled. Not exactly. He opened the door, and everything paused. Inside the gallery, the lights were low and golden. Soft jazz played from a speaker tucked into the corner. There were maybe a dozen people milling about, wine glasses in hand, murmuring in that hush that only happens in spaces built for art. Arthur stepped in behind Keanu, instinctively straightening the collar on his old security jacket. Then he saw the wall, and he stopped breathing. 6 paintings, framed, lit, displayed with the kind of reverence he thought had been reserved for other people. Younger people, louder people, people who hadn't disappeared from their own story. His brushstrokes, his colors, his memories, right there on the wall, and below them, a small printed card. Arthur Lewis. He took a step back, then forward again, like he didn't trust his eyes. His name, in type, like he was real again. Keanu stood beside him, quiet as ever. Arthur blinked hard. You did this?" Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. Arthur looked at the room again, at the people pausing in front of his work, tilting their heads, whispering, the same way people did at the galleries he used to visit before he stopped believing. He reached up and touched his name on the card, as if to confirm it wouldn't rub off. "You told me no one would care," Keanu said gently. "You were wrong." Arthur swallowed hard. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu said. "Just take it in." Grace approached from the far side of the room, offering Arthur a small glass of wine. He shook his head, politely, shakily. His hands weren't ready to hold anything fragile just yet, but he nodded at her. "You're the artist," she said warmly. Arthur hesitated. "I used to be." "No," she said. "You are." That never went anywhere. "We just didn't get the memo until now." She smiled and disappeared back into the soft crowd. Arthur walked the room slowly. He stopped at each canvas, like it was a long-lost friend he hadn't seen in decades, like he needed to apologize for leaving them in the dark. He stared longest at March 3rd, 1985, his wife's birthday. He didn't remember painting that one, but it made sense now. Muted pastels. A faint outline of a woman's hand reaching toward a sunlit window. The quiet ache of absence captured in 3 square feet. He didn't speak, but Keanu noticed how he stood straighter as he looked at it, like the weight had shifted, like maybe he wasn't just a man who used to be something. Maybe he still was. Later, as the crowd trickled out and the lights dimmed, Arthur sat on a bench facing his own work. Keanu sat beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Arthur exhaled slowly and murmured, "Feels like someone saw me again." Keanu nodded. "You were never invisible. You just stepped out of the light for a while." Arthur looked over at him, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled like someone who believed that. The morning after the gallery show, Arthur woke up before the sun, not because of age, not because of habit, because something in him wouldn't let him sleep. He sat on the edge of his small apartment bed, still dressed in his uniform from the night before, jacket folded neatly over the arm of a faded recliner. On the floor, leaning against the wall, was a paper bag. Inside, 6 framed paintings, wrapped carefully in brown craft paper, and a small envelope taped to the side with the words, "Your story matters, G." Arthur had been holding on to stories for decades. And now they were holding him. At the studio, the day felt like any other. Cables coiled, radios buzzed, crew members drifted in and out like clockwork. But something had shifted, not outside, inside Arthur. When he made his first sweep of the back lot that night, he stopped by his usual alley, where the stool and canvas usually sat, and just stood there. Not to paint, just to remember. The air smelled the same. The city hadn't changed. But he had, because now someone else had seen what he'd been hiding. He didn't see Keanu for 3 nights, and for a moment, he thought maybe the man had done what most do. Step in, do something kind, and vanish before they had to sit with it. But Arthur didn't feel abandoned. He felt respected, like the man had handed him the brush, not the frame. On the 4th night, Keanu showed up again. No fanfare, no lights, just the usual paper cup in hand and that quiet calm like a lighthouse beam in human form. Arthur didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, then looked away. Keanu sat beside him on a crate. "You okay?" he asked. Arthur chuckled softly. "I don't think I've ever been asked that by someone not being paid to ask." Keanu smiled. "Well, I'm not being paid tonight." Arthur nodded. "I think I'm okay. Maybe more than okay." A pause. "You know, someone recognized me on the subway today," Arthur said, eyes still ahead. "Showed me a photo from the gallery. Asked if I was Arthur Lewis. I didn't know what to say." Keanu sipped his coffee. "What did you say?" I said, "Not anymore." Then I laughed and said, "Yeah, I guess I still am." Keanu grinned. "That's the right answer." Arthur tilted his head, studying Keanu. "Why'd you do it?" "Do what?" "All of this." Keanu leaned back, letting the question sit in the air. "Because I've been helped before," he said, quietly, by people who didn't want anything in return. "And I've never forgotten how that felt." Arthur looked away, something welling behind his eyes. "I didn't ask for help." "I know," Keanu said. "That's why it meant more." Later that week, a package arrived at the security booth. No name on the sender, just the initials KR. Inside was a brand new easel, collapsible and light. A note was tucked into the side pocket. "Paint anywhere. You don't need 4 walls to be seen." Arthur set it up in the alley that night, and for the first time in decades, he painted with the intention of finishing something for others to see. Word of the gallery night began to ripple, slow but certain. A young reporter from a local magazine reached out for an interview. Grace passed along the message. Arthur turned it down, but he sent back a single sentence for them to print. Sometimes all it takes is one person to look long enough to see what never stopped being there. The studio crew started noticing too. A grip assistant asked him one night, "You the guy who had the show last week?" Arthur nodded. She smiled. "Cool stuff. Real soulful. My sister paints. She saw your stuff online. Says she's painting again because of you." Arthur blinked, then nodded. He didn't know what to say to that, but he felt it. Deep, solid, real. The following Friday, as Keanu packed up from a long night shoot, he found a small canvas propped beside his trailer door. On it, a painting of the alley behind the sound stage. Dimly lit, quiet, with 2 figures sitting side by side on mismatched crates. One was holding a brush, the other a cup of coffee. No faces, no spotlight, just presence taped to the back of the canvas for the man who never asked. Arthur. The alley wasn't silent anymore. Not loud. Never loud. But no longer just the echo of footsteps and the buzz of distant generators. Now it held voices, laughter, curiosity. It started with one young camera assistant who walked past Arthur's easel during a break and asked, "Hey, do you sell these?" Arthur looked up, surprised. "No, not really." "You should." He didn't think much of it. But then, a few nights later, someone else stopped. Then another. One asked if he could paint her dog from the photo. One brought him a coffee and said her kid had tried painting again after seeing his work online. She didn't even know how it got there. Arthur hadn't posted a single thing. He had a suspicion, of course. Keanu hadn't returned to the alley in over a week, but Arthur didn't feel abandoned. Keanu's absence didn't carry weight. It carried permission, like he had passed something forward and knew it was in the right hands now. Instead, Arthur painted every night, on good days and bad ones, when the wind was sharp and when it was soft. He painted joy, sorrow, memory. He painted life again, and people kept noticing. One day, Grace from the Rent Collective called and said, "We want to host another showing. Bigger. With you there this time." Arthur hesitated. "Me? There, you're the artist." Arthur didn't respond right away. Then finally, he said, "Okay, but I don't want it to be about me." Grace smiled through the phone. "It never was. It's about what you remind people is still possible." A week later, Arthur walked into the gallery. This time, not as a stranger, not hidden behind a security badge or a folding stool, but as Arthur Lewis, the artist. The walls were lined with his new work. Pieces he'd finished in the alley, in his apartment, even one he painted from memory. A simple chair, sunlight falling through a chain-link window, with a small coffee cup beside it. The title, "He Never Asked My Name." The place was packed. Students, local artists, gallery owners, even a retired teacher who remembered buying one of Arthur's old canvases in the 80s and cried when she saw him again. There were no cameras, no press junkets, but word had spread anyway. One by one, people approached Arthur not to praise, but to connect. A young woman said her father used to paint, then quit after losing his job. She showed Arthur a photo of his last painting. Arthur looked at it carefully and said, "He still sees light well." A man in his 20s said he'd just gotten out of a treatment program and didn't know what came next. He said, "Your work, I don't know why, but it makes me want to try again." Arthur listened to every word. He didn't have advice. He had presence, and that was enough. Somewhere near the back, half hidden by a tall potted plant, stood Keanu. No fanfare, no greetings. No one noticed him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He watched as Arthur stood beside a small girl, maybe 10 years old, explaining how to blend acrylics so the sky doesn't look like a cartoon. He showed her how blue can be soft if you let it. The girl's eyes lit up like someone had given her permission to imagine again. Keanu smiled. That's what it was about. He turned to leave. But before he could slip away, someone called out, "Hey, wait, Arthur." He had seen him. Keanu turned around, half smiling. Arthur didn't walk over. He didn't wave. He just nodded once. A slow, grateful, knowing nod. And Keanu returned it. Then he slipped out the door. Back in the alley the next night, Arthur set up his easel again. Not because he had to, but because the world still needed more color, more truth, more quiet people doing loud things with their hearts. He started painting a landscape this time. Not from memory, but from imagination. Somewhere in the peace, near the edge of a glowing horizon, there were two figures sitting beside one another. One held a brush, the other a cup. Across town, in a quiet cafe near the East River, Keanu sat alone with a notepad and a pen. He wrote something down, folded it, and tucked it into a book. It read, "Some stories need no spotlight. They just need to be seen by the right eyes at the right time." 6 months later, the Wren Collective hosted a community art night. Nothing fancy. No gala, no dress code. Just easels, string lights, coffee in paper cups, and a donation jar near the door that read, "Paint because you still can." Arthur arrived early. He wasn't the headliner. Wasn't even on the flyer. He came because he wanted to sit in the corner, offer quiet advice, and help kids mix color until it said something true. That was enough. A boy named Micah, maybe 16, approached with a sketch pad tucked under his arm like it was a secret. He hovered near Arthur's stool but didn't speak right away. Arthur didn't rush him. Eventually, the boy said, "You're the guy who paints alleys and fire escapes, right?" Arthur smiled. "Sometimes." Micah sat beside him. "I used to draw. Gave it up." Arthur looked over. "Why?" The boy shrugged. "Didn't feel like anyone would care if I didn't." Arthur paused. "Someone once told me, it's not about who sees it. It's about not letting it disappear." Micah blinked. "You believe that?" Arthur looked down at his hands. "I do now." Across the room, Grace hung a new piece on the wall. It wasn't Arthur's. It was Micah's. His first painting since age 12. A swirling mess of color, shadows, and brightness, all colliding without apology. At the bottom corner, for the first time in years, he signed his name. Just Micah. Arthur didn't see Keanu that night, but he felt him in the way the lights were arranged. Not too harsh. In the music, a soft jazz playlist Arthur remembered from a gallery months ago. In the simple cardboard box of fresh brushes, left near the back door with no note. Some gestures don't need fingerprints to be known. One morning, Arthur stopped by the gallery, early before opening hours. He carried a wrapped canvas under his arm. Grace looked up from her desk and smiled. "Another one?" He nodded, then handed it to her. For the back wall, she unwrapped it carefully. It was a street scene. Early dawn, painted in soft blues and pale gold. Two men sat side by side on a loading crate. No faces, just form, posture, presence. At the bottom corner, for the first time, Arthur had signed it. Not with A. Lewis like he used to. Just this, for the one who stayed. Keanu saw it 3 weeks later. He hadn't planned to be there. He was in the neighborhood, passing through between meetings, when he glanced through the front window of the Wren Collective and saw something that made him stop. Not the painting, the feeling. He stepped inside quietly, hands in his coat pockets. No one turned. That was perfect. He walked to the back wall. There it was. He stood in front of it longer than he realized, not because of what it showed, but because of what it remembered. He didn't touch it, didn't take a photo, he just looked and smiled. Then, before leaving, he slipped something into the donation jar by the door. A folded card and an old paintbrush with dried red bristles. On the card, hope doesn't always shout. Sometimes it paints. Arthur never saw him come or go, but the gallery owner found the card that night and gave it to him. Arthur didn't say anything. He just picked up a brush and went back to work. That spring, a group of students from a public high school in the Bronx visited the gallery. They stood in front of Arthur's first canvas, the one called March 3rd, 1985. One of the girls asked the docent, "Why is it called that?" The docent shrugged. "You'd have to ask the artist." But Arthur was already gone for the day, so the girl just stared a little longer, then whispered, "Feels like remembering," and moved on. A year later, a community arts program launched under a new name. It wasn't branded. It wasn't flashy. It didn't carry Keanu's name anywhere. But at the entrance, there was a simple mural of a man in a hoodie and an old security guard sitting under a fire escape, paintbrush between them. Below it, the words, "You're not invisible. Not to me. Not anymore."